Welcome to the NICU Dad Podcast, a podcast for NICU dads by NICU dads. I'm Alex Zavala, a father to two preemie girls, Mia, who was born at 30 weeks, and Emerson, who was born at 27 weeks. Combined, my wife Jen and I both spent over 100 days in the NICU. After my last NICU experience, I started the NICU Dad. I did this to try and fill the gap of information and support that was lacking for NICU dads. Be sure and check out thenicuDad.com, and hopefully you will find it a useful resource. In this podcast, we will cover many topics that NICU parents face, but from the NICU dad's perspective. Topics such as premature birth, bereavement, PTSD, and many others. These dads who you'll hear share their stories in hope of letting other NICU dads know they are not alone.
Many NICU families had never heard the phrase neonatal intensive care unit until they found themselves in one with their very own preterm baby. Often, preemies are born early with no warning, giving their families little time to prepare for the stress and trauma the NICU environment can bring with it. While NICU dads are not the ones giving birth, the NICU experience can still cause them just as much anxiety and have lasting effects. Navigating how to handle those emotions thrust on you is difficult to say the least. Here to talk with us about his own NICU experience is Mike Kelley. Mike is a father of two children, both born preterm. He is a certified public accountant and managing partner at Wheeler, Fairman & Kelley in Austin, Texas. He is an alumni member of the Young Men's Business League and graduate of the University of Michigan. He is also a card-carrying member of the Rat Fan Club. He can recite every line of Star Wars and is best at eliciting eye rolls from his family with lame dad jokes.
Today's guest is Michael Kelley. And you may have heard of his wife, Kelley Kelley, who is the founder and CEO of Hand to Hold. Michael, just want to welcome you to today's episode, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And sharing your story with us. Let's just get it started, and just kind of let us know, describe to us your NICU journey and how it started. I believe you had two NICU babies.
Correct.
And your oldest is Jackson.
That's right.
And what was that like? How did that start off? Were you guys already high risk, or?
We were not high risk. Our journey started with me sitting at the dinner table alone, waiting for my wife to come home from work. And at 6 o'clock, I'm in my softball uniform, ready to go play a game. And when she got to the house, she looked at me and just started crying. And I knew something was terribly wrong. So we called our parents, our mothers. I forget which. I think it was my mother who was available. Her mother was still traveling back from vacation. And my mom asked us some questions, and Kelley was bleeding at the time. So we were told to call 911 immediately, which we did. When the ambulance arrived, they checked the baby's heartbeat, and it was a healthy 120 beats per minute. And they started packing up and said, false alarm, good to go. And I said, no, there's something very wrong here. I could just feel it. And so I insisted that they take her in the ambulance. And by the time we got to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes later, they had called ahead in the ambulance and said, she's in labor. So I'm following in my truck behind them. It was harrowing. It was tough. But we get there. They take Kelley into a dimly lit room, examination room, and the nurse broke her water and then said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do." To which I responded with disbelief and started to run around the halls looking for someone to help, screaming for help, that kind of a thing. And at the time, the hospital was it was not busy at all. It seemed like it was a ghost town, is the best way to describe it. And pretty soon, there were 15 people, I counted them, that came out of nowhere, seemingly, and went to work saving our son. And that was our prep for the NICU. Along the way, I didn't know what a NICU was, and the doctor explained to me that there's a 50-50 chance of survival, And if he survives, there's a 50-50 chance that there will be something drastically wrong or some sort of challenge that we have to deal with. And I said, so you're telling me we got a 25% chance that everything's going to be okay? And he said, not quite. But I said, why are you telling me this? And he said, because I need to know what to do. I said, go to work. Do what you can. Do the best that you can. And they did. They did a great job getting him stabilized. But from the time that I was sitting at my table to the time he was born was exactly 93 minutes. And everything happened very, very quickly. I recall being put into scrubs when they decided that they were going to do emergency C-section. And that was to distract me, I'm sure, because as soon as they were ready to begin the operation, I was taken out of the room and just left on my own in a room, in scrubs, in total shock and disbelief. I did not know what was happening. It seemed like a really bad dream.
Now, that moment, I just want to focus on that moment real quick, just because talking to a lot of NICU dads, and I know for myself, not many people understand or can even fathom what that moment is like to be in those scrubs, whether it's before you walk into the operating room, or even like in your case, them having you sit by yourself. What was that moment like for you? I know what it was like for me. What were some of the thoughts that were going through your head?
Well, I thought I was going to lose both my wife and my child, and that I was going to be alone. It was very scary, very lonely, in complete disbelief and shock. And there's some physical attributes that go along with that. You know, your heart's racing, your palms are sweaty, the room gets a little darker, and it's just, you just cannot believe that it feels like a bad dream. It's the best way to explain it. Yeah. It just does not feel like real life. The first family member to come up to the hospital was my sister-in-law, and she came in and she looked at me and said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "No, I'm not all right." Normally I would say, "Yeah, I'm okay." Mm-hmm. But I was not all right. And I just remember having my hands on top of my head. My head was down, and I was like, what is going on? But from there, I mean, I didn't have a whole lot of time, because as soon as they took him out of Kelley, they pulled me back in, not totally all the way in, but I got to see him. And from where I stood, he did not look like he was alive. He just looked like a wet, limp baby bird. And there was no life in him. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't wiggling. His arms were just hanging from the side. And I thought it was over. And I said, "Is he alive?" Kind of thinking, that he's not. And they said, "Yeah." And I remember the next question I said was, "Is it a boy or girl?" Because we didn't know at the time. Yeah. And they said, "It's a boy." And so I had a little bit of hope at that moment, but I was still scared to death, and did not know what was going to happen next. Like I said, I didn't know anything about what we were about to go into. Yeah.
So Jackson is born. I guess the next thing now is Kelley needs to recover.
Yes.
And what was that like, having the baby in the NICU now? Your wife is having to go and recover from this major surgery.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, Kelley, after the fact, told me that she does not remember much of the first week, and certainly none of the first 2 to 3 days. But she was still recovering when I got to see Jackson for the first time. So I was alone in there, and it was starting to get later because, like I said, he was born at 7:33. And it took a while for them to get him situated in the NICU and to allow me in. But I do remember it being late. And so I'm in there. It's after midnight. And they told me to go home. But I didn't want to go home. Yeah. I wanted to see him. and I sat by his bedside, and the nurse was being very nice and talking to me, telling me what I needed to do and not do, the scrubbing in process and all that stuff. But it was very lonely. It felt like Jackson and me against the world, and I'm looking at him. He's under saran wrap, and I'm thinking, we're in a world-class facility, and they're warming him with saran wrap. Is this right? But it was tough. It was real tough.
So that first day is usually one of the longest for NICU dads.
Yes.
When did that day end for you?
Well, that day ended about 4 a.m, I would say. I looked pitiful. I must have looked pitiful because the nurse that was on duty for Jackson that night saw me and said, "Come here, come with me." And mind you, this is pre-HIPAA, but she walked me around the NICU and showed me. It was just the two of us and a bunch of babies and other nurses, but I was the only parent there. So she walked me around and showed me the different bays, and without telling me much about each kid, she just said, these are kids that are a little further along, and then we got that all the way to step down, and that was the step before you get to go home. Mm-hmm. So I recall during that tour, Kelley's in bed and she's recovering, and she hasn't seen any of this yet, but I just recall popping in my head. I said, okay, so this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be helping people like me who have had this experience, and I know my wife is going to do something with this, and she did eventually.
That's incredible.
But driving home alone, 3:30 in the morning, only place open was Whataburger. Stopped and had a lonely cheeseburger with myself, and just could not believe what was happening.
Yeah.
And that first day is a tough one. And every day it felt like every day was a week to me. The first week was every day was a week because I was told to just live day by day, and that's what I did. So
now that first week,
mm-hmm.
How tough was that first week?
It was very difficult. Getting used to new surroundings, getting used to new people, new rules, trying to interact with Jackson without hurting him. I was told not to talk too loudly, don't touch him too much. So I would put my pinky out, and he would grab my pinky, and his hand wouldn't even fit around my pinky. It was so small. And I would just sit there and whisper to him and sing quietly to him, and just so he'd hear my voice. And I did know that would help. That the nurses said, you can talk to him, just don't be loud, don't make any startling noises. And my routine, I was working. I'm an accountant, and I had worked downtown. So every day my routine was to wake up as early as possible. As early as the nurse would take the phone call, I would wake up, and I would call and get a report on him the night before. And then before work, I would show up to see him. At lunch, I would take a 20-minute break and go see him. And then after work, I would go to the NICU and spend as much time with him as I could. And then I would repeat the whole thing over again 105 times. And I didn't miss a day. I didn't go 3 times a day every day, but that was the normal. But that first week was rough because Jackson had to have a surgery for a PDA, the patent ductus arteriosus. And that was on day 5. But by then, we were so stressed out and so, just exhausted from the whole experience. And it felt like it felt like 5 weeks had gone by, and it was only 5 days. My parents were in town, and my in-laws were in town, and we went to my house and cooked a steak dinner out, on the barbecue grill, and had some beers and got to celebrate a little bit because he had gone through the surgery and it was a success. And that was our first big hurdle that we cleared. And we allowed ourselves that moment of real life instead of just being in the NICU, in the zone, and worrying all the time. I'm a worrier, so I spent a lot of time and energy doing that.
That's you've given me something to think about. It seems like we go in as warriors and come out as warriors.
Yes. Yes, or semi at least.
Yeah. So you guys, so now I always talk about the NICU dad shuffle, and that's when you have mom recovering or in one room, baby in the NICU, and then everything else.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like for you? Especially, I guess during that first week, how long did it take for her to recover? And, were there any other surgeries that came up? Or
Yes, not in the first week, though. Jackson had a hernia operation later on, closer to discharge.
Okay.
So we had to deal with hernias for most of his stay, double hernia. And the first week, though, looking back on things, this is something that I think dads might want to perk up to and listen to. I didn't really think about what Kelley was going through. I just thought that everything was okay with her and that I was the only one that was having a problem. Mm-hmm. And she said later on that she didn't really bond with our son immediately, but I did. It was like a light switch had been flipped. Mm-hmm. When I saw him and they said he's alive, I instantly was bonded with him. I can't explain it. It just happened. And for her, it took a little bit longer, which is normal, but she beats herself up for it because she didn't have that feeling. But I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know this until years later when we were talking about it.
Yeah.
So when I would come in, I was excited that he was alive. I was excited. I had this Polaroid picture of him, and I was showing it to her, and she didn't even want to see it. She was in that phase where it was too painful.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited on the one hand. I'm scared as I could be on the other hand. And she is recovering and not where I am at all. Yeah. So it was hard, but we didn't realize how hard it was in the moment until later. Just very stressful. But she, after about 2 or 3 days, I think it is, I may be off on this, but as soon as she could, she got in there and saw him, and we couldn't touch him. We weren't able to hold him for the first 6 weeks of his life, which I know now they do differently. They do the kangaroo care earlier, but we weren't able to really touch him other than having him hold our pinkies, or maybe just gently tapping him on the back or on the bottom. So she came in and saw him, did what she could. She talked to him. She tried, but she wasn't there like I was. Yeah. Just different timing. So yeah, it was a tough week. Very tough.
And so now we go in that 105 days in the NICU. Mm-hmm. That grind, you described your schedule for us. Mm-hmm. Did you find where she wasn't where you were, was there a catch-up?
Oh, yeah.
Kind of?
She caught up pretty quickly. But in the beginning, she really didn't want much to do with the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's instinct. I think that her body was telling her that she either miscarried or, the baby didn't live. Yeah. I don't purport to be an expert in female anything, but it seemed like a natural reaction to a traumatic situation. Yeah. But she caught on and caught up very quickly and became his primary caregiver very as quickly as we could. She was pumping breast milk, which I think helped to stabilize him and get him further down the road quicker, or at least hold on while his respirators would help him to grow. So she was an amazing. She was pumping religiously, and so she would have to do all that, pump and then store it. We'd have to go into the NICU and store it, freeze it, and all that, because he couldn't drink as much as she was producing.
Mm-hmm.
And we were saving as much as we could. We bought a deep freeze, the biggest one we could buy, and we filled it. I mean, every last square inch of that thing was filled. And we also gave some away to the mother's milk bank along the way because we knew he couldn't possibly use it all. But, she was doing what she could, and when the nurses would allow us to change a diaper or, do the little sponge bath or whatever it was that needed done, she would be the first one to do it. And so I would watch her, and then I would give it a try. But she was great.
That's awesome.
She was great.
So you guys go through 105 days with Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously nobody comes out unscathed.
Mm-hmm.
We deal with what we deal with. But your story doesn't end there. You guys get pregnant again.
Mm-hmm.
And are you now high risk on your second pregnancy?
Yes.
This is
point.
Honestly. So Jackson, we're talking about what year?
2000.
In 2000.
Yep.
So now you guys are expecting, what year is this?
2003.
2003. All right. So are you high risk for this pregnancy now?
Absolutely. And Kelley had a cerclage for the second pregnancy. Her doctor said, "Don't worry, we'll do a cerclage. Everything will be great." And we believed him until week 34 when Kelley's water broke at midnight and in bed. And she sat straight up in bed and said, "I think my water broke." And I jumped up, and I'm running around like a crazy man because of our first experience. And I'm thinking, here we go again. But Lauren was born 6 weeks early, and she didn't need a lot of the same treatments that Jackson needed. However, because of the fact that Jackson was born so early, and Jackson's blood type is O positive like mine, and Lauren's blood type is O positive like mine. Kelley is O negative. Because Jackson was born so early, it created a problem for Lauren. And I don't understand how that works other than the blood mixed together between Kelley and Lauren, and there were some antibodies in there that were attacking her red blood cells, her being Lauren. And Lauren was severely jaundiced and was dying, in essence. They needed to give her a blood transfusion and a drug called, I think, RBRG. I could be wrong off on that. Mm-hmm. But for that, Lauren would have not made it. And she looked like almost a full term, from what I stand with a 1-pounder. She was born at nearly 5 pounds, and she looked way bigger than all the other kids in the NICU. So that was a tough deal. But we were only in the NICU for a week with her. And at that time, I was in a bit of denial because she wasn't on the respirator, and she was, we kind of treated it as a reunion of sorts because all the same nurses were there, same doctors, mm-hmm. and they knew us, we knew them, and it was fun to see them and talk about Jackson and where he's come. But it got really scary when her jaundice wasn't getting better, and she had to have that blood transfusion. And I remember standing there watching the machine, and I watched it dispense the entire transfusion over, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it was. And just, it was hard. It was really hard. It reminded me of standing over my son, willing him to breathe because he just decided he didn't want to breathe. So, yeah, very difficult.
So, I want to kind of find out, one, that having a baby in the NICU already, first pregnancy, now you're pregnant again. During that pregnancy, before any complications or anything, so let's say, at week 30, mm-hmm. were you, quote unquote, normal?
Absolutely. Everything was textbook again. And so I think what they told us is that she just has babies early.
Yeah.
I think the cerclage helped to not have her go into labor as soon. I could be wrong, but there were no warning signs. There was no preeclampsia. There was no nothing. Everything was great.
Yeah. Were your stress levels in that pregnancy, like, everything was kind of
much better this time? However, I was very sensitive to when the moment came. The stereotypical dad who freaks out when it's time. But it's because when you're asleep and you get awakened at midnight and you're early again, that's does not do well for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you drove into the hospital and.
Yeah, we drove. We drove that time.
Yeah.
She did not have to take an ambulance that time. And I remember, to this day, Kelley gets on me about this, but I was kind of getting angry with her, saying, let's go. And she said, it's okay. It's not a big deal. We got time. And by the time we got her into the car, she said, drive, move it. Yeah. So we were screaming down I-35 here in Austin and got to the hospital and started all over again. But this time it wasn't as life and death. It was a little more normal. I got to stay in the room this time for the C-section, and that went very quickly. It was amazingly fast. I couldn't believe how fast they could do that. So I got to be there when she was delivered, which was nice. I got to be with Kelley. She was conscious this time, which was nice. And it felt a little more normal. But I'll tell you, when Kelley got real upset was when she left the hospital and we couldn't take our daughter with us. That made her really upset. Because that was her goal, was to have a baby where she could be wheeled out of the hospital with her baby at the same time. And didn't happen again. So I remember that being really tough for her.
Yeah, that's a mother's dream. I mean, my wife deals with the same thing. There's no pictures of you wheeling your baby out.
She would actually get angry with the mothers that had the balloons tied to the chair and everybody's there and it's a big deal. She got real jealous of that and didn't like seeing it. Yeah, I kind of resented the kids in the nursery as I walked by, saw these huge babies, and then I get to the NICU and they're all, 1 pound, 3 pounds. It was tough.
Yeah, so this was 2000 and 2003. We're now in 2020. What I do want to talk to you about is the perspective of a NICU dad who has not only gone through one NICU stay, but 2. And I always tell everybody, it doesn't matter. It could be, a year. It could be 6 months. It could be 3 days. You're in the club. You've experienced it.
Absolutely.
It's all the same almost. What things have you seen from yourself that you identify from going through this? And without listing, everything that a NICU dad goes through. But what things do you see now that you've seen in these years out of the NICU that you still deal with now or experience through those years?
Well, a lot's happened. And I can tell you that I'm a person who's predisposed to general anxiety. And people have told me I'm a little tightly wound. I worry. I'm anxious. I've had panic attacks, but before that, I remember my anxiety about you're always in the NICU. When you have a NICU baby, they're always a NICU baby. The first, he's born in August, and a first cold and flu season rolls around 4 months later, and 1 month after we get him home. So RSV is on our minds, not just this year, but next year, because they told us we're in a 2-year window. Yeah. So there's just lots of anxiety about, he went home with a heart monitor and 5 different medications that we had to administer. We became his nurses, and just the anxiety about that, and trying to keep him safe and my daughter safe. there was this tension, just this overall tension. And when you hang on to something that tightly for that long, it has an effect on your body. So it wasn't until, and one other thing is, about a year after we got out of the NICU, Jackson had to go back for surgery again for his hernias. One of the hernias had come loose. And when he went in for the surgery, I thought at first it was not going to be as big a deal. That was the hardest thing that I had done, including the NICU, because I thought we were done. Yeah. I thought we were out. And the surgery went long, but it was a success. But it went long, and I just remember that feeling of dread and anxiety, waiting, and it was a couple of hours or 3 hours, but to me it felt like an eternity. And I'm holding my breath, waiting for the doctor to come out. So fast forward about 14 years after that, I needed surgery, and I started having panic attacks, and I started to really dread the surgery as it was coming closer and closer. And it was a pretty routine shoulder surgery. But I got so freaked out by it that I canceled the surgery, and I waited another year. But right before I canceled the surgery, I had a pretty major panic attack, and I started having them more and more. And one day I remember I went into the shower, and for some reason that's when I do a lot of thinking as I'm getting ready in the morning. But the word surgery popped into my brain. I could see it. And all of a sudden I started crying, and it all came out. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is my surgery is reminding me of what Jackson went through. And I got some counseling. And I do take anti-anxiety medicine now, and things are more normal. But I just could not believe how real it was, and how right back in the NICU I was 14 years later. It was like I had never left. We were right back in that war zone.
And this was how many years now?
This was about 14 years after that. So it was about 5 years ago from today. Yeah.
And now currently Jackson and Lauren are doing what right now?
Jackson just returned to his college, where he's a freshman, starting his second semester there. And Lauren is a junior playing volleyball for her school team, junior in high school.
Awesome. That's incredible.
Yeah. And they both have They get A's and B's. They get good grades. They're good kids. Very proud of both of them. And they both have had a lot of people working for them and with them to get where they are. But they've done the hard work, but they've had a lot of help along the way.
What are some of the things that you've noticed with your kids, just in general? Do you see anything from being born premature or their NICU stays that you've noticed in your children, these years?
Yeah, mostly what I think about are the processing delays. Everything's been a delay, and some things haven't quite gotten there, but they're getting there. My son and my daughter both they had some learning challenges, but they overcame them. My daughter had a visual processing, and I think probably some auditory processing delays. And when we were teaching her how to read, we didn't realize, we thought she was dyslexic, and we took her to some therapists, and they said she's not dyslexic. She's just not following the normal path of reading. So when you would read left to right, top to bottom, she would start in the middle of the line and read to the end, and then she would drop down and start at the right-hand side and read the other way. Stuff like that. The only way we knew that was they did pupil tracking for her to see what she was looking at.
Wow.
So we've been through as many therapies and that type of thing as were available for us at the time. My son had lots of sensory integration issues. I do recall one time, when he would supposedly act up, he wasn't really acting up. He was just acting out because of his sensory. He needed a lot of input. He wasn't the type that didn't want to be touched. He wanted a lot of, hands-on. And so he would go around and he would hit kids on the playground. And we'd say, get on him. You can't do that. You can't hit anybody. And so he'd say, okay. And then he'd go right back and he'd start hitting them again. And I remember pulling him aside and spanking him. And it didn't work. And I said to him at one point, I said, do you want me to spank you? And he looked at me and he goes, yeah. And I said, okay, we need a new approach to this. Yeah. So that's when we learned about sensory integration disorder, which I thought was, not real.
Yeah.
But it is very real. So we did a lot of auditory therapy with him, the occupational therapy, and then with the sensory stuff, we did this brushing technique, which I don't know if you've heard of, but there are these little, brushes that you would use to wash your fingernails. They're real soft,
mm-hmm.
and you brush their skin with it. And it doesn't feel like a brush. It just feels like pressure on the skin. And you brush down their arms and their legs and their back, and you do that 3 times a day, along with other things. And then we also do joint compressions, where we take their joints and kind of push them together, and it releases certain chemicals in their brains. That's what they're striving for. Is this? I don't know if it's dopamine or what, but when you exercise or you're running and you get that so-called runner's high, that feeling of that's what they're going for. So we did the brushing, and Jackson's fine motor skills suffered, and to this day he has a hard time with things. So he can do things now, but it took him a lot longer to do mm-hmm. that. And as a first child, I didn't know that he was behind.
Right,
I thought, why can't you do that? But I thought, all right, well, you're just a new one. I don't know when you're supposed to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But I kind of had a feeling that he wasn't picking this stuff up like he should be. And it turns out I was right. And then I had my daughter afterwards, and she was doing stuff, right away mm-hmm. that Jackson could never do. And then it really drove it home. It was like, okay, yeah, he really had a delay in that area. So.
Man, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So now let me ask you, having these NICU experiences all your years now, out of the NICU, and also too now with you guys in the work you've done with Hand to Hold, what is some advice that you would give to new NICU dads,
mm-hmm.
guys that are just coming in, let's say day 1, week 1? What advice would you give to them?
Well, first off, I don't envy anyone in this situation. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, period. So gear up, because it's going to be a grind. I was told it's going to be a roller coaster ride.
Mm-hmm.
I hated hearing that. I just hated hearing that. But it is true. You take 2 steps forward, you take a step back. And for someone like me who, and most guys, most dads, they want to fix things. Like, let's move this forward. Let's fix this. So you fix one thing and then something else breaks. Really hard to handle for someone like me. Trust, for advice, I would say trust your nurses. Be nice to your nurses.
Yeah, definitely.
Advocate for your child. One of the things that we learned was the more you are involved in the NICU, the better off your child will be. And that, I think that's been proven statistically. But the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that's true. If you're there, and you're there like I was 3 times a day, and my wife was there when I wasn't there, and with me, we were there pretty much around the clock. Nurses knew that, and they knew that they had to tend to our baby and they knew that we were asking questions. They were held accountable. Not that they wouldn't do their jobs anyway, but it's just that extra little bit, and all that stuff adds up. So advocate for your child. Talk to your doctor. One of the things I'll say that we experienced in the NICU was our doctor that was our primary doctor, and I think there were 9 doctors at the time that were on rotation. Our primary doctor was new in this group, and he was from Houston, and he was the outsider, and he had a different way of doing things that I didn't know about until much later. So he would implement a certain series of instructions, and we would come back the next day, and he's not there, and it's all changed. And then it would happen again, and it would happen, and I'm like, what's going on here? Why do you keep changing things? And so when we finally got to the point where we could talk to more people there and we felt more comfortable, just the simple advocating for your child, we got him on a more routine, regimen, and they weren't changing respirators, they weren't changing the oxygen levels and whatever else. So it's hard enough for these kids to make it, but it's harder when the kids are in the middle of a political battle between doctors, different methodologies. Mm-hmm. So we got that lined out, and I would say that don't do what I did, which was to be kind of self-centered in how I approached it. It's so hard that you don't realize that you're going through this with somebody else. Hopefully, not everybody will be going through this with a significant other, but whoever's in there with you is going through the same thing you are, and don't underestimate how it's affecting them, because what affects them may not affect you the same way, and vice versa. Something that rolls off your back might be really traumatic for your partner. So I would say to talk to your wife and make sure that she's taking care of herself, and make sure that you take care of yourself. Get sleep, eat right, do some exercise, try to get some routine in your life, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to handle this grind. You think you can, but eventually you break down. Yeah. For me, I broke down, totally broke down the day that we got him home, and I didn't even know it. I was, again, in the shower, standing there, and out of nowhere, I start bawling, like the biggest cry I've ever had in my life, and I didn't realize how much I was holding on to. But eventually your body will say enough, and so that's the advice I would say, is to be nice to everyone, and be nice to yourself as well.
That's some great advice. Now, let me ask you, I'm 6 years out of the NICU. Do you have any advice for NICU dads that are already out and, are just living life now with everything that we carry around?
Yeah. If they haven't done any counseling, I would encourage them to do that. Even if it's not so-called necessary, it can't hurt you. Talk it through, because I didn't realize, and I wasn't actively suppressing my feelings. It just happened. I didn't realize that. Maybe if I had talked about it a little bit more, maybe I would have processed through some of this stuff and it wouldn't have been as difficult. But the problem is you get home and now you are taking care of a NICU child who's fragile. You're trying to keep them safe, keep the RSV away, keep the people with their germs out of your house and from touching your baby. And I didn't even want when we drove him home, I didn't even want to take the highway. I wanted to take all back roads. I mean, it was every little aspect of his life. Okay. Well, on the counseling front, I would say to go ahead and talk to some support groups. Mm-hmm. Listen to podcasts like these. The more information you get, the better. And feel free to talk to your wife about it, or your family members, or whoever you feel comfortable with. It doesn't have to be a counselor, but talk about it. But like I said, the hard part is you're in the moment of caring for your child, and one day turns into the next, and then you have another child. At least for me, now we have 2 kids at home, and I thought that would just be twice as hard. Turns out it's exponentially harder than one child. And you just get very, very busy, and life gets busy. And then it's preschool, and then it's kindergarten, and, t-ball, and on. And you're just constantly round the clock living your life for your children, and you're not really looking at yourself too much. So just like you're in the NICU, you got to take care of yourself, do it out of the NICU. Take care of yourself, get your exercise, eat right, sleep right. And, even if you don't think you have a problem, which you may not, but there's something there. You don't go through the NICU unscathed. You just don't. It changes a person. And you're scarred. It's not a bad scar. It's just a scar. You've been through a trauma, and that was explained to me, is you've been traumatized. Don't deny that you've been traumatized. So deal with it. And, not doing anything is not dealing with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think I could have said it better myself. For a moment there, I thought you were talking to me specifically.
We all have a similar road there.
Yeah. No, we definitely don't leave unscathed, and that's it's part of the reason why we're both here right now.
Yeah.
But I want to thank you so much for sharing your story and your insight.
Certainly.
And also, on a personal note, I want to thank you guys for everything that you're doing with Handhold and everything that you do. But
it's our pleasure. I'm glad we have the opportunity to help. And I know that when we did this 20 years ago, there were no services like this available. And I just knew Kelley would do something with it, because that's the type of person that she is. And as long as it's helping others, then we're happy to keep going with it.
That works. Well, thank you, Michael, and I want to thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your support. Once again, please take a look at thenicudad.com. We continue to grow the list of resources we are bringing NICU dads. To my fellow NICU dads, good luck, and remember, you are not alone.